Well, we want to welcome everybody to the AICA Docility EPD release webinar. Really glad to have Dr. Mark Allen on with us today to talk about the release of this new trait. I know we got into some great questions as we brought this trait out. It's the first trait that we've had in a number of years. So really great to be able to work with the membership and work with the Breed Improvement Committee and the subcommittee on new trait development and to have Dr. Mark Allen on here. So Mark, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you. This is a lot of fun. New traits are always fun to introduce and get rolling on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a bit of background on this EPD release as we modeled it over the summer and are glad to bring it out to the membership. This was a part of several different new traits that we're able to start to bring to the membership. And that really starts at a committee level. So as you guys as members see needs that we have out in the industry, we start with a subcommittee that works on identifying which ones are most important, which ones make the most sense for positioning the Charolais breed to move forward. And then we bring those back through the Breed Improvement Committee for further input, and then ultimately pass that through the board acceptance to be able to allocate budget for modeling these, and then also looking at data collection. That's so important, and we'll talk about that in great detail, why that's so important here. So Docility as a new EPD was released with the August AICA evaluation just a couple days ago. I know this was really important to several members. I know it was very important to the board because docility is an area where the breed has made incredible strides in the last 20 years. I know from a bull buyer perspective, there were some folks over the last many years that maybe leaned away from the Charolais breed in terms of their bull selections. And we've made great progress as a breed to find those lines of cattle that work really well not only in these seed stock operations, but also for our bull buyers, which we care so deeply about. So when we think about docility and we think about selecting those right genetics, it really starts there, but of course it has great benefit for breeders too. We all want to create those genetic lines that are easy to manage, those that we feel comfortable with in terms of having on our own operation at home. And then, some of the things that you don't think about maybe every day is docility really follows the genetics all the way through the chain. And so there's some great research that shows that cattle with improved docility actually grade better as they go through harvest. Certainly, they're easier to handle, whether in a stocker operation or a feedlot operation. And as those cattle stay less stressed, as they stay easier to work with, it just improves efficiency and improves performance every step of the way. So docility to us and being able to select the right lines for docility, as well as all the other important traits that we select as a breed, really is an industry value package. And that's why we're especially excited to start to release this new tool. So when we think about docility, it was interesting because anytime you model a new trait out like this, you're always curious about the heritability of it. Can you make progress selecting for it generation after generation? In this case, as we modeled this EPD, it became highly heritable in terms of that EPD prediction at a 0.44. And that's particularly impressive because that ranks right up there with growth and carcass traits. So that tells us that we've got the ability to make great genetic advancement as we use this tool. And also, not only is it the importance of data that goes into the tool that allows us to really show the cattle that we have at home, but being able to utilize genomics to even get us there even faster is an important part of this equation. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. But genomics essentially allows us to take these very unproven animals, to look at those SNPs and genetic markers, and to compare those to very proven animals in a population and draw those comparisons in to add more accuracy to what our predictions are. So not only is it a highly moderately heritable trait, we can actually even go pedal down faster as we select for this trait and improve that even faster by using AICA genomically enhanced EPDs and our 100K testing options. So we'll talk a little bit more about the factors that go into a new trait release, but obviously data as driven by the membership is the most important underpinning to what we do. It's so important to be able to get those properly formed contemporary groups to get your cattle represented well, because that's how genetic evaluations work. It allows us to take away the environmental aspects as best we can and start to understand the actual genetic potential of the animals. And then knowing that in some cases we're going to be able to manage that moving forward, but we're always going to be breeding better cattle as long as we keep our mind on the data and the genomics and ultimately making those breeding decisions as we have for decades to make the breed better and to make the breed more profitable at every step in the industry phases. So a little bit about trait accuracy. When we think about those high heritabilities or moderately high heritabilities, and we think about genomics, those really add to that trait accuracy. And I know Mark has some great points to share on that as we get deeper in this presentation as well. But when we think about that accuracy, that's really predicting how much variation we're going to see in terms of what to expect from those genetic lines. And as we get more and more accuracy all the time on those animals as they go through their productive life, it becomes very important to see how important things like genomics are to factoring in an early look and increasing that accuracy and removing some of the guesswork as we get the cattle really clarified in terms of the genetic predictions we're creating. A quick reminder, as you submit those records, those phenotypic records, they do establish a discount through our genomic credit program. So as you might remember, this is a program that allows you to look at 7 different traits, and you can select up to 4. And if you're willing to submit the data in properly formed contemporary groups, you can get $5 off per trait, up to $20 per genomic test. And that just allows us as a breed to continue to bring lots of the phenotypic data or the data records in and marry those with the genomic data that we know is valuable to moving it forward, and to make it cheaper for producers to do both at the same time. So if you have questions about how to qualify for that genomic credit program, we'd ask you to reach out to staff. We're glad to walk you through the details and how to get that done. But again, this is a great illustration as we release these new traits as a means of the genomic credit program being able to lift the increase in data up and ultimately help members get a more productive tool when it comes to these new EPDs. So at a high level, and we'll talk in great detail about how to best use this new EPD, but that docility EPD is expressed as a percentage with, in comparing two animals, a higher EPD, meaning that that animal during its productive lifetime, their progeny is expected to have a higher probability of those progeny being docile versus the lower animal. And so with EPDs, I think it's always important to bear in mind, certainly we're always looking for genetic advancement, but that really starts in how we made our cattle at home. That starts in dam and sire selection. And this docility EPD doesn't really say what's necessarily good or bad or within your threshold, but you as breeders have the opportunity to decide the best way to use the genetics. And hopefully this tool arms you to make a more informed decision about docility, just as these others do in terms of performance and calving ease, maternal traits, and carcass traits. So again, we'll talk in greater detail about how to utilize these different functions. We did want to start off with how are these records scored? And so we have a BIF standard of a 1 to 6 scoring system, and these scores are collected at weaning, with 1 being the most docile and 6 being the most aggressive. And so when we're looking at this initial data set and we're bringing all this data in to create this EPD, these scores is what comes in and builds the backbone of where this genetic prediction begins. And then, of course, we utilize other things such as genomic testing to continue to come in and create this new trait. And so I want to make sure that everyone's always very aware on that 1 to 6 aspect, to be careful not to flip those upside down, or to always realize 1 being most docile and 6 being on the other end of the spectrum. So how was the trait created? We worked with AGI to model that over the summertime. And we took and ended up with about 6,000 records at a weaning time window in terms of looking at how we could start to set the parameters for how we'd create that genetic prediction. We utilized over 65,000 genotypes that were already on file, ultimately to start to create that framework to create the footing for that EPD to be created. We don't only look at individual animals and their genomics or even their individual records when we do that, but that is the function of a genetic evaluation. And we look at a four generations worth of pedigree data and how all those different animals are related to allow for additional proof to come in and around what in many cases is obviously an animal at weaning time that doesn't have any progeny on hand. So being able to understand how these genetic evaluations work and how the data feeds them, just like the genomics do, this starts to help you understand how important these pedigree ties are as we go through this, how important the individual records are, but also bearing in mind there's going to be countless producers all across the country also scoring similar bloodlines of cattle, even if they're not half siblings to yours. But there are pedigree ties to allow that evaluation to start to pull the trend lines out in what one can expect from a new trait such as this. Some additional factors that came in on the equation as they modeled it included age of dam and calf age in relation to the window that was provided around that 205-day weaning weight window, and of course, contemporary groups. Those are such an important part of building accurate predictions, accurate models, and ultimately, the end result, as AGI modeled this out, was over 144,000 EPDs created for 144,000 animals within our registry database. So that allows us to go look backwards in time based on all those family ties, all those different pedigree ties, as well as the existing data that we had here today. Now, I think it's also always important that at AICA, when we go into the registry system and we do these ranks, you'll see breed percentages vary a little bit based on the number. And that's because as a breed percentage, we're looking at active sires, active dams, and non-parents. And the interesting thing and a real testament to Charolais breeders and AICA members is the non-parent population mean was actually a higher docility than the active sire mean. So we were already in the state of making this genetic progress, and this EPD illustrates that. But as you're looking at those breed percentile rankings, you're able to look at those non-parents versus those parents, and it's going to give you a little different look in terms of what we're looking at there as that animal relates to the rest of the breed. So I wanted to show a quick illustration just as we think about utilizing tools like this. And so this is a non-parent percentile ranking across all the traits, and you can find this online at charolaiusa.com. It gets updated throughout the year with every evaluation that we run. And of course, when we think about selecting those animals, we're thinking about comparing two individuals and seeing what the difference in any particular trait might be. And so this table does a great job of illustrating where docility on the far right column lands as a percentage within the industry. And you'll see that a 30 places you in the top 1%, and a negative 23 places you down at the bottom end of the breed, and will show a distribution of those animals across that. But of course, this isn't new to many folks, but it's always good to start to understand where we are as a breed, where these animals lie, and then where our animals lie in relation to the animals we would select to mate them to bring that genetic progress along. And so every time that we release a new trait, again, we're working with a subset of the animals when it comes to that new data that's come in. And it's important to remember that as we're looking to show this new trait, as we're looking to allow the tool to see the animals as well as it possibly can, the very first version of an EPD is never the best version. And we're going to continue to flood that with more and more and more records. And that just gets it stronger and stronger. These evaluation tools are only as good as the information you put into them. So we'd strongly encourage you, if you're interested in the Docility EPD, be sure that you're measuring those cattle at weaning at home. That's the only way that the evaluation tool gets the information about your cattle that it needs to be able to put them in an accurate prediction aspect. And then certainly we'll discuss how to best utilize mating techniques if you want to make advancements in this a little later on as we get into some of the Q&A. But as we think about this, and it's our natural default as breeders to want to go higher and higher and higher. But as we release something like this, Mark and I were visiting about a few different aspects, and it was a little bit interesting. So we wanted to provide a look at the very first release here, and even an illustration of what a couple different animals might look like as we're looking at these percentile rankings. So we'll go from this one into a couple highlighted areas here. And so as we look at an animal in the top 30% of the breed, that has its docility EPD at a 17.6. If we look at an animal in the top 70% of the breed, that has its docility EPD at a 9.8. So if you were to take 17.6 and subtract 9.8, you're left with about an 8-point difference. And so to be able to understand what that means as you're using the EPD, over the expected lifetime of that animal, you would expect the higher docility score in this case, their calves, to be about 8% of those calves more would be docile versus the lower scoring animal. And so sometimes we look at EPDs, and this is an important reason why we look at these breed percentile rankings. We can get a wash in numbers, and it's not always fun. And it's especially not fun to sometimes try to explain it to bull buyers as well. But when you're looking to make genetic progress here, that describes the difference in percentage of progeny of that animal that we would expect to be more docile coming out of that animal's productive lifespan. So when we work with a large population of animals across a variety of EPD distributions, these tools are always interesting to look at because, as Mark and I have discussed it, when you release a new EPD, your bell curve, so every one of these data points being reflected on this animal, and essentially the black curve that you see here being all the registered animals that we have that have the EPD, well, that's going to be a little tighter than over time. As we get more and more data, we'll see that bell curve broaden out a little bit. And that's just a function of the tool doing its job, allowing us to dig in a little deeper, allowing us to see the genetic variation a little bit more, but realizing that with this non-parent group of animals, that mean is around 13. And you can see as you go much, much higher, how much fewer animals there are as you get down to the right-hand tail of that curve. And then obviously, as you go to the left-hand curve as well, you can see how many fewer animals there are there. And so as we start to think about that in relation to that tightened curve, knowing that it'll broaden out as we get more data in there, but ultimately knowing that it's guiding us in the right direction, we put together another graphic that maybe shows that percentile ranking in a little different way, particularly in relation to that comparison that we just looked at between those two hypothetical animals. And so what I've done here is taken that EPD distribution and put it to scale across the breed percentile ranks. And again, this isn't perfectly aligned exactly, but it gives a very good visual illustration that the vast majority of those animals in the breed that have the EPD are going to be between the 30th and the 80th percentile. So is it our job that care about this particular trait to continue to move that bell curve up more to more docility? Absolutely. It's an association tool. If you've got an interest in using it, we strongly encourage you to do it. And also if it's not as important as some of the other tools that we offer, we understand that too. But as you look at that example that I shared earlier, and looking at an animal in the top 30% of the breed, he or she is pretty far up on that bell curve. And if you look at an animal in the top 70% of the breed, you see that difference there, and you see all the animals in the population, a vast majority that are there within that. So we thought this might just be a good illustration that as these curves go, they're not perfectly even. Obviously, those are representing all the animals where they lie within the population. But as we're thinking about making progress by utilizing this tool, seeing animals at the 50th percentile, at the 60th and 70th percentile, that is certainly not necessarily a negative thing. And especially knowing that using genomics and in many cases using actual data from those operations, you're going to be able to see the effect, touch the evaluation, and change those EPDs to get those cattle accurately reflected, especially as their accuracies of this trait increase based on that data and based on those genomics. So, Mark, I might toss it to you for a second. Do you have any additional perspectives as we look at this non-parent percentile ranking in relation to that EPD distribution bell curve?
And a big one to think about too on a new release of a new trait like this, and you alluded to it earlier, and this does a great job of graphically showing that the distribution of the middle of the population is the variation is not massive. And so that's really important to think about. If you're at the 70th or 65th percentile, with a low accuracy, where that animal falls in that, the possible change could be quite a bit over time with progeny improving a young sire in that. So it's a guide to think about where the animal falls. It's not necessarily its exact genetics, right? Because we're dealing with EPDs which are predictions, and as accuracy increases, that prediction becomes more like what their true genetic merit for that trait is, but it still has a possible change around it, even when we're up at zero point 0.6 and zero point 0.7. And so just because an animal is really high doesn't mean it's not capable of producing an animal that has an EPD that's low. Genetics can be brutal that way in how Mother Nature pairs things up from those chromosomes that we can't control. But by using that information, thinking about it on a bell curve of your whole population and moving that mean in the right direction, you move away from creating those animals that are lower like that have a higher probability of having a disposition issue. And it's just so it's moving that bell curve, moving that line over time, with as much information as we have. And compared to all of us that grew up with the introduction of EPDs, with what we have and we know about the importance of phenotyping and progeny proving animals, along with the use of genomics to show those relationships, to how closely they are related to a full sib, a quarter sib, and other animals with like phenotypic values, derives that accuracy at a younger age and allows us to move that bell curve, that mean of that population, or my population, your population, faster in the direction you want it, and eliminating some of those lower animals, of the proportion of those. Maybe it's really small, but instead of having 5 dispositions a year that were from genetics, maybe in 3 years, you're only seeing 1 or 2 of them a year in your population that you go, wow, that one sorting wise was quite out there, quite aggressive. And you look with the EPD and go, oh, look at that. It's making sense.
I think that's a great point. And again, we as a breed, I feel, have been doing this. We just maybe haven't had the full information that we'd like to have to be able to identify what our next step is in terms of genetics, whether that's in herd or outside herd, using AI or using embryos or our next herd bull purchase. So it's exciting to think that this probably recognizes for bull buyers to be able to bring them back into the fold, to physically put a number in front of them and help them understand that there won't be as much of a propensity towards a disposition issue. but it's really arming the membership with a more informed tool to do something that they're already having some success with the means of having even more success. Very good. Well, we had a series of common questions that we thought we'd get into. I know, again, it's been a number of years since we released a new EPD. And so this we thought would be a great opportunity to get Dr. Allen on the line and to be able to talk through some of these common questions. We would like to encourage you to go to charolaiusa.com as well. There's a nice two-pager there, which provides a good solid overview of how the trait was developed and how to utilize it. Of course, you're going to see quite a bit more information in the Charolais Journal and on social media, and then, of course, this webinar. We do want to always let you know that whether it's Dr. Allen, who serves as a genetic consultant for AICA, or Maggie or Sarah or anyone on staff, we'd love to hear your questions at any time. When we're creating these new tools, especially, that feedback is important. In some cases, we'd love to be able to dig in and explain what you're seeing. In other cases, we just need that feedback so we can continue to keep refining these tools as best we possibly can. And so a big part of that is just starting that dialogue, and we wanted some of these frequently asked questions to hopefully start to set the stage if you had some questions that you may want answered. And obviously, if you don't see them answered on this, we'd love to hear from you as staff. So again, we highlighted this a little bit earlier, but Mark, what exactly does this new EPD measure and how is it calculated?
So starting reverse flip the question just a little. So it's calculated based on phenotypic scoring being done at weaning in a window, a given window of time that is based on 1 being extremely docile and 6 being like really, really aggressive, really, really nervous, way out there, right? And so that data going into that genetic evaluation is produced as a percentage, a probability of an animal being docile, a probability of an animal being aggressive. And you just look at like Brett said earlier, looking at the difference between two animals, this difference in number, like a 15 versus an 8, that's 7. Think of it then as that 15 has a higher probability of producing more docile animals than the one with a 7. In thinking and in utilizing that information.
Yeah, another good point that came up as we were modeling this. In many cases, we had data sets within a contemporary group that were all scored the same. So maybe talk a little bit about why we can't necessarily use that as we're creating that data infrastructure behind an evaluation.
So the key to all the traits in genetic evaluation is being able to pull out the environmental differences that are happening from location to location across all the different parts of North America. And so utilizing contemporary grouping at a given location, that allows us to, with connectivity to other locations due to genetics through pedigree relationships, allows us to pull that environmental variation out and get the true genetic merit. However, when we score everything, like every animal out of 100 head that we scored is docile at a 1, the lack of variation, we have nothing to work with. And so those phenotypes then cannot be utilized then in the genetic evaluation. So for that given trait with no variation, we've got phenotypes that we're unable to use. And so the variation within a population, even with some of the most docile animals, there's variation. There's an individual in the group sired by that sire that is a 2. I mean, you see that just like personalities and families and stuff. They all may be pretty level-headed, but oftentimes in a big enough family, there's one of them that's maybe a little bit more squirrely than the rest of his siblings, and cattle or livestock are no different. It's that distribution of variation. And when we don't have variation, we have information that's not adding to the genetic evaluation. It's not sorting out that genetic merit, so it basically doesn't do us any good. It'd be like turning in every one of your birth weights at 85 pounds and then wonder why your sire's EPDs never move because they can't. It's not explaining the variation within, because a sire is not going to produce all 85-pound calves. He's going to produce a distribution because of what happens with the chromosomes coming from him, from his makeup of his grandparents. And everything is based on how well we can understand the variation within a contemporary group, and then how does that relate to its connectivity when it's with compared to other contemporary groups to get at genetic merit.
Great. Next common question: how should I interpret a higher or lower docility EPD in terms of animal behavior?
So just because an animal is lower doesn't mean that it is crazy or is doesn't behaves in a way that you should be nervous about. It just says that genetically this animal might have a tendency to produce more animals with a little bit of a disposition issue. However, we need to take into account accuracy, progeny equivalence, all that. Genomics has given us a little bit better snapshot of what that animal's genetics are. Think about it like being able to score a handful of progeny that animal produced, like that, but it's a day old. And so it's giving us that snapshot of where that animal might sit on the in the relative to the EPD is high or low. And so I often think about it as if I'm making selection decisions and I'm utilizing multiple traits, and in most cases I am a big proponent of utilizing indexes, but then setting criteria of, I call it threshold traits. So saying that what I have these females, they're all of like in the top 10% for TSI, I can only keep 25 of the 30. What's going to help me make the decisions? And phenotype wise, I've scored them all at a point where I haven't been able to separate. I've got to eliminate 5. Well, I've got 5 of them here that are a little lower, or maybe they're quite a bit lower on docility. Let's utilize this information to help take some of the risk out that maybe she is transmitting some of those genetics that are a little bit nervous unrest. Utilize it as a decision maker like that, and you can do the same thing with matings and in pushing it up.
Great. What kind of data was used to develop this EPD, and how extensive was the data set?
The data set did a great job of capturing data for quite a long period of time and building the base of it. When you look at the report from AGI and the summary of it, going quite a number of years back in time, did a great job too. It looked like the participating producers across a lot of North America. There will be Canadian data coming in this fall, which will actually make it better and move it. So that part of it's great. However, we always need more data. We always need more better contemporary group reporting. We can never not do that well enough, I guess, is that grammar, my dyslexia makes any sense there, that we always can be making sure that we're getting our contemporary groups reported, we're getting the variation captured that's in those contemporary groups, and adding more producers, adding data. Data still in this age of computers that can run these models that we have with massive amounts of data now, and with genomics making it better. The tools are better, but phenotypes are still gold and still drive the backbone of this. Phenotypes plus genotypes with all the other information is how you make it better. So this EPD will get stronger over time. There'll be some animals that flip-flop due to data and because of limited numbers and contemporary groups that it was reported here and he didn't look too good. Well, then when enough contemporary groups that have used those bulls and phenotype, you'll see some bulls move around a little bit. That's normal with genetic evaluations, right? It's a prediction. And the highest accuracy bull, I think, in the evaluation right now is 0.83, if I remember correctly. He's also one of the um, uh, top docility bulls in the list, and he's been used fairly heavily. So he was obviously a popular bull used across a lot of different herds. And so, but this data set was great. The heritability alone speaks to the quality of the data in itself. Being able to come up with a 0.44 heritability it was excellent. Lends to the quality of the data. Also lends that it's not a super noisy data set that it would mess with that number for this trait. Yeah.
Very good. How does this EPD account for environmental or handling differences between operations?
So that's the importance of the contemporary group at your location. And it allows then a group of, like, let's just use sires for example. In your environment, you're scoring. It's a subjective trait of a 1 to 6. So your 2 might be somebody else's 3, but that gets taken care of by the contemporary grouping and the ratioing that's done with the animals within your contemporary group. That's how we eliminate the bias differences of Brett's scoring subjectively might be just slightly different than mine. And with any traits that we score like this, and hope, like you look at udder and teat, and traits like that down the road and stuff, that's how we eliminate the subjectivity and put everything on an even playing field.
Absolutely. And we got in some good questions about this early on in the last couple of days of, well, I handle my cattle with a lot of care and I'm a very good stockman and I don't necessarily see some of these genetic trends that maybe you're talking about. So I think it's also important to realize not everyone handles cattle the same. I'm not even saying size of operation or region, but everyone's going to handle cattle a little bit differently. Some folks are eager to be out there with them at all points of the day and certainly understand that, and others are maybe not with them quite as much. And so being able to lean on the value of a genetic evaluation allows us to take, as you said, some of that noise out of this to be able to gather that information and say, okay, how do we as a breed pull a genetic trend out of this in a way that allows most people to be able to get the access to the right genetics for their operation. Again, knowing that everyone's going to have different thresholds, everyone's going to have different um, goals as they're mating an individual cow or flushing a donor or selecting a herd bull, based on how they handle those cattle at home, what their management techniques are, and what they ultimately want to create in the lines of genetics that they offer.
I think a real good example and a way to think about that everybody can relate to is people will say, well, my ultrasound values, my EPDs maybe aren't moving or that much because I don't feed for ultrasound. But within a contemporary group, the variation that is being found by ultrasounding all these animals, if you develop yearling bulls at a slightly lesser weight, there's still a variation around marbling to not what the percent marbling actual number is, but the variation in what would across that population of high, medium, and low versus an individual group that maybe feeds really hard for yearling weight. Yeah, their percentage of raw data may look different than yours, but there's still a distribution. And so that contemporary grouping takes that noise out of how the differences relative to that and puts it on an even playing field to get at the genetic merit, the variation between those genetics.
Absolutely. Next question. Can I submit my own shoot score temperament data? And if so, how?
And definite yes on this one and make sure the system. So you can get online and do animals individually. You can also submit your data sets to the association and the team there will get them uploaded for you. So if you have 200 head that you've just done, that opportunity to submit and upload that data, great. And if you have historical data in sets, it is still extremely valuable and will add to the genetic evaluation. It's not like it has to be this year or this fall or this spring, or it can be 2 years ago and you've been gathering, you just need to get it submitted. And is the key on that. And as we keep evolving, the online tools and things, this ability to upload data sets, I know is a big thing that Brett and the team and the board and everybody it'll become even more seamless to upload large, small, whatever data set size set it is, with ease.
Absolutely. Will this docility EPD be included in the standard registration papers and performance reports and in animal lookup?
Yes, so it already is. I mean, and if you look at your on go online and do an animal search and start looking up your animals, you'll see the EPD. You'll see in the registration that has now been updated, and format just changed a little to add docility and do some general changes. And Brett, you probably can explain the handful of changes that what the registration paper maybe looks slightly different.
Yeah, so what we did was in order to create a little more space there, we did remove the sire and dam EPDs and kept the individual animals EPDs, knowing that that information, as that certificate is printed, particularly on sires and dams, we can access all that online at any time. And the more real-time look at those EPDs is always going to be made available online. So when we issue a registration certificate on an animal and then say market it a year later. A lot of times those EPDs are already very outdated, but we did make that space by bumping that siren dam EPD table off to allow for some of these additional new traits to have the space to represent them for that individual animal on its individual registration. So I think many of us though that like to follow EPDs and utilize them heavily, we know that anyone can access that information online at charolaiusa.com under the registration tab. And we've got a really great tool there in the sire dam selector to search through and sort based on breeder and sires, dams, any kind of EPD thresholds you'd want to find. And it helps you hone in not only on the animals that have that particular set of attributes you're looking for, but also that's updated with every evaluation every month. So that's the most real and current genetic prediction we can give you, and that's available to anyone, not only just members, but available to anyone that's curious about EPDs in the Charolais breed. Very good. How can I balance docility with other economically important traits when making breeding decisions? And I think this is a great question because I feel like we as a breed have done an exceptional job of being able to understand real world performance, the importance of creating a genetic package to go out and work in the commercial industry, and then also not necessarily always crowding the edge on any one particular trait. I think as a general rule, Charolais breeders do an exceptional job of thinking about those traits that are particularly important to commercial cattlemen and cattle feeders in the industry, and then finding that right balance. And you mentioned index strategy earlier as we reworked TSI to catch it up to speed in terms of market fundamentals here a handful of months ago. But maybe speak to that a little bit. We know if you are interested in docility and you do want to make these approaches, how do you best recommend someone balance that? Because we as a breed association don't want to tell you how to breed cattle. It's our goal to put tools in your hand to help you do a better job of it. So, Mark, any thoughts on how you'd balance creating selection pressure and advancement around docility in relation to some of these other economically important traits when we're thinking about breeding cows this fall or this spring?
I I like, and I mentioned it earlier, think about like utilizing it in decisions where you might have like a threshold. And so you've got your indexes, your sets of animals. If you're doing individual matings and you've got your lists, You have a dam that, let's just say she's in like the bottom 5% for docility. So you look at your list of bulls that have the TSI, and maybe you're looking at some calving ease and other things that you, as you match like numbers and think about what brings her the farthest that I can do with multiple traits. Okay, she's a little low. What's my list of the best docility bulls that I have to use, and which one of those, or a couple, two or three, whatever your system is, make that best decision. And so it's not a I never recommend using single trait selection. Gets people in trouble. Yeah, you'll move things fairly fast, but the end product may not be where you want it to be. But utilizing groups of traits and having your criteria and then adding what percentage of importance is it in your operation? Is it something, and keeping an eye on it and that along those lines. And that, everybody has their own strategies in that, and going about it. I use it very much thinking about clientele, where parts of the deal, the aging of our cow herd owner population. Um, Oftentimes when you see these surveys that are done, docility ends up fairly high up there.
Yeah.
Because of the improvements that have been made across the beef industry and calving ease, those management things and making it easier, because we have to do it a lot of things with a lot less labor. And docility becomes one of those things that enters somebody's mind, if they've ever struggled with animals that have an issue in this area. And so you have to, in your own operation, put it into perspective, but I recommend using it in that kind of fashion.
Great point. And it's always interesting to think about some large scale ranches that use Charolais bulls, and certainly some smaller operations. If you're a smaller operation and you have a job in town, and that's a lot of us, me included, uh, docility means a lot. If you're a very large scale ranching operation, well, you've got so much work going on. And you mentioned age of operators there, Mark, but also just the labor shortages that are out there. The last thing in the world you want is an issue that you turn out with your cows. So you're totally right. As we've done the Charolais Bull Buyer survey about a year ago, docility ranked very high in terms of temperament was actually the word we used, but bull temperament really did resonate with those bull buyers, right alongside performance, right alongside the things we know are economically very important, because we we certainly want the beef industry for those producers to be profitable, but we want it to be enjoyable too. And so certainly this is a way to tie that together.
And but to make sure that, also, and in kind of a flip side to us pushing and saying, take it into degree, and that is don't throw the good out with the old bathwater, because just because an animal's low, remember, it's an expected progeny with an accuracy with possible change, and we're in the early days of an EPD. So use it. If you use it, you will move the bar, but I wouldn't condemn every animal that tends to be in a lower, like in the bottom, 5 percentile or whatever. And so, but use it in a way to improve, and continue to do that. And in some times when you have a tight decision, or what's been interesting to look at is when if you are working animals and you've got some that you're like, whoa, these three, write their numbers down, they are out there. And then you go back and look up their EPDs and you're genomic enhanced, and you're like, wow, two of those are like way at the bottom. Maybe that one that's a little bit, maybe she's just participating. And when we wean off, we put her in with some other ones, and we're bunk feeding them or whatever, and we see if she kind of settles down and gets over it. But that EPD maybe is obviously confirming on those other two that, hey, they have a genetic propensity to maybe be a little bit on the low side.
Is the docility EPD heritable enough to see meaningful improvement in a single generation? And so a lot of times we think about EPDs almost in a surgical sense, and that's great. Like when we think about that, but also we got to bear in mind that as we make genetic progress, the way we get there in the most efficient way and the most effective way is to do it over multiple generations. But I thought this was a great question for you, Mark. What can one expect right out of the gate within a first generation of starting to select for this alongside all those other economically relevant traits?
I would think back to it like if you remember the early days of trying to improve birth weight and your EPDs over time. If your population was big enough, and if we start talking about statistical size and stuff, and you have thousands of animals in a generation, you could put pressure on it and see the population bell curve move in the right direction. There's very few probably operations that have in a single generation thousands of animals born. So it's hard to see based on the sampling and as the EPD moves, but generation to generation with that kind of selection where you're utilizing and pushing, the mean will deal. And the best way to follow that is to look at the trait trends that are for the entire Charolais breed for different traits from year to year. And what's neat is on docility, it has a positive trend already going on. So the producers as a whole, the breeders have been selecting for it and have been improving it. We might see an uptick and more than likely will over the next few years, maybe a little steeper gain because now we've got it in a genetic evaluation and we have genomic enhanced EPDs. And as we get more phenotypes with more genotyped animals in, if the genetic trend was like this, we might see a little boom. We're making improvement faster over the next 3, 4, 5 years, that change of that instead of it being running like what the breeders have been doing without an EPD. And that'll be, but so seeing a lot in one generation or a little bit, possibly a little bit, but over time you're going to see that change with the tools and as the EPD gets better, more animals, more phenotypes, more genomic enhanced, more breeders participating, allowing us to eliminate more background noise in the EPD itself.
Very good. Well, that concludes those questions. Thank you, Mark, and great job. I did want to close this out by just reminding members that as we're collecting these in this data collection phase for these other new traits as identified by the membership and by the board, don't forget to capture this calf vigor and mothering ability data, foot structure and feed intake data. Of course, those all qualify you within that list of 7 potential options for that genomic credit program. But as we think about modeling these EPDs, we've budgeted for it. We have the clear direction from the committees and the board and the membership. And at this stage, it's a matter of getting enough records, phenotypic records, to model those out. So this is where it falls back to the membership to see as many of those data submissions as we can get within those properly formed contemporary groups. You can find information about scoring your cattle there on the website at charolaiusa.com. Again, great to have Canadian Charolais as an evaluation partner to help us get there twice as fast, but also for US based members of AICA, bringing those records in allow us to not only create it to begin with and initially model it, but as we continue to feed that system with more and more information, it just creates a much more reliable tool even faster, even when we see highly heritable EPDs kick out like this one with docility. So we truly appreciate all those members that submitted docility phenotypic record data, and also those that are participating in this data collection phase on these new traits. If you have any additional ideas around new trait development, we'd ask you to reach out to staff, reach out to board, or anyone on the breed improvement committee. We'd love to factor that in as we're looking right now at our strategic planning in a 3 to 5 year sense. These are things we have to plan for from a budgeting standpoint. So really a pleasure to work with you on this, Mark, and others that were such an important part of this release. As always, if you have questions or ideas about ways we can improve this organization, we want to hear from you. And we look forward to hopefully having you tune in to the October board meeting for a little more information as we release this EPD, as well as a a variety of other great improvements and enhancements that we're going through as an organization right now. So all members are invited to come in person to those board meetings. All members, if you can't be there in person, next best thing is to hop on Zoom. Bring your questions, bring your ideas. We truly appreciate the membership that keeps this organization moving forward. So with that being said, Mark, any final closing thoughts as we wrap this up?
The opportunity, the phenotypes drive this, and so if you have questions related to phenotypic collection, contemporary grouping, any of that, please reach out to any of us. More than helpful, and especially on the data and the list. If you have feed intake records that go back years and years, uh, get us aware, get them to us. We can help trace down maybe even opportunity if it's need there's with the groups that originally did it. But as we drive all this forward, a lot of opportunity, a lot of exciting things on the horizon.